Do people ever stay married just for their kids? I asked. Dad dropped his fork. Mom said, That's a silly question, Lily. Soon they started locking their bedroom door, whispering more, watching me. The night before I was supposed to leave for Westside Academy, I walked into the living room with printed documents. I'm not going tomorrow. Mom looked up from her phone. Lily, what are you? I slammed Grandpa's will on the coffee table. The $2 million inheritance. I know about it. They both froze. Dad's face went white. Where did you get that? I know you're only staying married for money. I know you're sending me away so you can split up. Mom scrambled off the couch. That's not... You're misunderstanding. I pulled out the printed paternity test and dropped it on top of the will. I also know Dad's not my father. Dead silence. Mom's face drained of color. Dad's hands started shaking. That's when the doorbell rang. Everyone froze. Who is that? Dad demanded. I looked him dead in the eye. I called your parents. They only found out Andrew is my father yesterday. I opened the door, and James's dad stood there looking like he was ready to kill someone. My stomach dropped when I realized I'd said the wrong name on the phone in my panic. This was Grandfather, Dad's father, and the look on his face made me step back. His eyes went from worried to absolutely furious in about 2 seconds. He pushed past me into the living room without waiting for an invitation. Mom and Dad were still frozen on the couch, staring at him like they'd seen a ghost. Grandfather pointed at me and said I should go to my room while the adults talked. I shook my head hard. This was my life they'd been lying about for 14 years. I wasn't going anywhere. Mom jumped up from the couch and practically ran toward me with her arms out. She tried to pull me into a hug while saying I misunderstood everything and they could explain. I stepped back so fast I almost tripped over the coffee table. I told her not to touch me. My voice came out louder than I expected, and it made her freeze. Dad just sat there on the couch looking like someone had punched him in the stomach. His hands were shaking in his lap. Grandfather's voice cut through the room like a knife. He demanded to know if what I told him on the phone was true. Was there really a paternity test showing Andrew was my father? Were they really planning to send me away to some facility? Dad opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Mom started talking really fast about how it was complicated, and they'd been trying to protect me. Grandfather told her to stop lying. I walked over to the coffee table and put down the printed will. Then I put the paternity test right on top of it. The room went completely silent except for Grandfather's heavy breathing. He was staring at the papers like they might explode. Mom took a step toward the table with her hand reaching out. I told her I had copies in 3 different places. She stopped moving and looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before. It was like she was doing math in her head, trying to figure out how to fix this. Dad finally stood up from the couch. He looked at the papers and then at me and then at Grandfather. Nobody said anything for what felt like forever. Grandfather checked his watch and said we were stopping this conversation right now. It was almost midnight and everyone was too emotional to think clearly. He told Mom and Dad they would not approach my room tonight. His voice was scary calm. He said he was sleeping on the couch to make sure I was safe until we figured out what happens next. Mom started to argue, but Grandfather held up his hand. That's when Dad finally spoke up. His voice was shaking with barely controlled anger. He demanded I hand over all the documents and tell him where the digital copies were stored. I said no. The only way they were getting anything was if they agreed to family counseling and canceled the Westside Academy enrollment. Mom actually laughed. It was this scary, bitter sound that made my skin crawl. She said I had no idea what I was doing or how much trouble I was causing. Grandfather told her to be quiet. He walked over to me and put his hand on my shoulder. He said we were going upstairs now. Mom tried to follow us, but Grandfather told her to stay where she was. We walked up the stairs together and he followed me to my room. He checked both windows to make sure the locks worked properly. He tested them twice. Then he turned around and looked at me with sad eyes. He said he was sorry he didn't know about any of this sooner. If he had known what was happening, what they were planning, he would have stepped in months ago. He told me we'd talk in the morning after everyone calmed down. I should try to get some sleep even though we both knew that was impossible. He squeezed my shoulder and left, closing the door behind him. I heard his footsteps going back downstairs. Then I heard voices arguing, but I couldn't make out the words. I sat on my bed and stared at the wall for a long time. My hands were still shaking. I pulled out my journal and started writing down everything that just happened. I wrote exact quotes as close as I could remember them. I wrote timestamps for when Grandfather arrived and when we went upstairs. I wrote down how Mom tried to hug me and how Dad demanded the documents. I wrote for almost an hour until my hand hurt. Then I took out my phone and photographed every page of my journal. I uploaded the photos to my school Google Drive account, along with pictures of all the documents. Knowing the proof was safe in multiple places was the only thing keeping me from completely falling apart right now. I lay down on my bed with all my clothes still on. I could hear Grandfather moving around downstairs. At some point, I heard a door slam. I stared at the ceiling until the sky started getting light outside my window. Morning came and I heard Mom making breakfast downstairs. The smell of pancakes drifted up through the vents like some kind of sick joke. She was pretending everything was normal. I got dressed and went downstairs. Mom and Dad were sitting at the kitchen table in complete silence. Grandfather was drinking coffee and watching them like a hawk. There were plates of pancakes on the table, but nobody was eating. The fake normalcy made my skin crawl. I sat down as far from my parents as possible. Mom asked if I wanted orange juice in this cheerful voice that sounded totally wrong. I didn't answer. I pulled out my phone and texted my best friend. I told her I needed her to hold on to something really important for me. We arranged for me to give her a flash drive during lunch. Mom noticed me on my phone and reached across the table for it. Grandfather's voice stopped her cold. He told her to leave me alone. His tone made her hand freeze in midair. She pulled back and looked down at her plate. Dad cleared his throat like he was going to say something, but Grandfather gave him a look that shut him up. I finished my text and put my phone in my pocket. Nobody spoke for the rest of breakfast. When it was time to leave for school, I grabbed my backpack and headed for the door. Grandfather said he'd drive me. Dad started to protest, but one look from Grandfather made him stop. The car ride was quiet. Grandfather asked if I was okay, and I said yes, even though it was a lie. He said he'd be picking me up after school, too. When we got to the school, I went straight to the counseling office. I didn't go to my locker or look for my friends. I walked up to the front desk and asked if I could talk to Larson about a family emergency. The secretary took one look at my face and picked up the phone. 2 minutes later, Larson came out of her office. She cleared her schedule right there and led me into her office, closing the door behind us. I sat down in the chair across from her desk and tried to figure out where to even start. I pulled the folded papers from my backpack and spread them across Larson's desk one by one. The will came first with the yellow highlighted section about divorce forfeiting $2 million. Then the paternity test showing 0% probability that Dad was my father. Last was the West Side Academy brochure with its glossy photos of smiling teenagers that looked nothing like the reviews I'd found online. Larson picked up each document and read it carefully without saying anything. Her pen moved across her notepad in quick strokes. I watched her face for some kind of reaction, but she kept it neutral and professional. When she finished reading, she set down her pen and looked at me. She asked me to walk her through everything from the beginning. I told her about overhearing my parents that night, about finding the evidence on Dad's laptop, about the plan to send me away in 3 weeks. My voice stayed steady even though my hands were shaking in my lap. Larson listened without interrupting and took more notes. When I finished, she was quiet for a minute. Then she said this was serious enough that she was legally required to file a report with Child Protective Services. My stomach dropped. I knew that was probably coming, but hearing it out loud made it real. She explained that emotional neglect was really hard to prove in court. Parents could be cold and distant without breaking any laws. But the plan to send me to a facility against my will was different. Combined with the evidence about their motivations and the money it gave CPS, something concrete to investigate. She said the report would trigger an investigation, and someone would contact me within a few days. I nodded, but my throat felt tight. Larson pulled a business card from her desk drawer and wrote her cell number on the back. She told me to text her anytime if I felt unsafe at home. I took the card and put it in my pocket. We sat there for another minute in silence. Then the bell rang for second period and Larson wrote me a hall pass. I grabbed my backpack and headed to class feeling like I'd just set something in motion that I couldn't take back. The rest of the day dragged. I couldn't focus in any of my classes. My mind kept replaying the conversation with Larson and imagining what would happen when CPS called. When the final bell rang, I walked out to the parking lot where Grandfather was waiting. The car ride home was quiet. He asked how school was, and I said fine. When we pulled into the driveway, I saw both my parents' cars already there, which was weird for a Tuesday afternoon. I went inside and found them both in the kitchen. Mom was chopping vegetables at the counter. Dad was sitting at the table with his laptop. They both looked up when I walked in. Dad closed his laptop and asked where I was during last period yesterday. I froze. My mind raced, trying to remember what excuse I'd planned. I told them I had a stomachache and went to the nurse. Mom stopped chopping and turned around. She asked if I talked to anyone about our private family business. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were hard. I kept my face blank and said no. Dad stared at me like he was searching for lies the same way he used to check my homework for mistakes. He asked if I was sure. I said yes and headed for the stairs. Mom called after me saying dinner would be ready in an hour. I went to my room and closed the door. My hands were shaking. They knew something was wrong. They just didn't know what yet. That night, I waited until I heard their bedroom door close around 11. Then I pulled my duffel bag out from under my bed and started packing. I grabbed clothes for a few days. My laptop and charger. My phone charger, even though I wasn't sure how much longer I'd have service. The bottles of vitamins I took every morning. I made copies of all the documents on my phone and printed extras at the school that I'd hidden in my locker. Those went in too. When the bag was full, I texted my friend asking if I could leave something in her garage. She responded in less than a minute saying yes. She said her mom knew something was wrong and I could stay with them if I needed to. Reading that message made my eyes burn. I sat on my bed holding my phone and cried for the first time since the confrontation. Not big loud sobs, just quiet tears running down my face. After a few minutes, I wiped my eyes and finished packing. I needed to stay focused. I moved my desk chair in front of the bedroom door and wedged it under the handle. Then I went to the hardware store website on my phone and found a rubber doorstop. I'd bought it yesterday during lunch and hidden it in my backpack. I pushed it under the door from the inside and tested it. The door wouldn't budge. Next, I went to each window and checked the screens. The one by my bed popped out easily. So did the one near my desk. I looked down at the drop to the bushes below. Maybe 10 feet. I could do that if I had to. The fact that I was planning escape routes from my own house made my stomach hurt. I put the screens back and climbed into bed with all my clothes on. I stared at the ceiling for hours before finally falling asleep. The next morning, Larson pulled me aside before first period. She said she submitted the mandated report last night. CPS should be calling me soon. Maybe today or tomorrow. She reminded me about her cell number and told me to text anytime if I felt unsafe. I nodded and put my hand in my pocket where her card was. It felt like some kind of lifeline. Something solid I could hold on to when everything else was falling apart. She squeezed my shoulder and told me I was doing the right thing. Then she sent me to class. During lunch, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number but answered anyway. A woman's voice asked if this was Lily. I said yes. She said her name was Victoria Lewis and she was calling from Child Protective Services. She asked if I could talk privately. I grabbed my backpack and headed for the library. The study rooms in the back were usually empty during lunch. I found one and closed the door. Victoria asked me to tell her about my home life. I explained everything. The overheard conversation. The evidence I found. The plan to send me away. She asked specific questions about how my parents treated me, whether they provided food and shelter, whether I felt safe. I tried to sound calm and factual instead of hysterical. She took notes and asked more questions. The call lasted about 30 minutes. When we finished, she said someone would be doing a home visit soon, and I should expect to hear from them. She thanked me for being brave enough to speak up. I hung up and sat there for a minute trying to process what just happened. When I got home that afternoon, I tried to check my messages, but my phone had no service. I went to connect to the Wi-Fi, but the password didn't work anymore. I found Mom in the living room and asked what was going on. She said they decided to limit my screen time because I'd been acting out. She gave me this fake concerned look and said too much internet wasn't healthy for teenagers. I knew exactly what they were doing. They were trying to cut me off from outside help. I went to my room and grabbed my laptop, but the Wi-Fi password had been changed there too. I was completely isolated in my own house. The next day during study hall, I used the school Chromebook to log into my email. I had messages from Larson checking in. I responded saying my parents cut off my phone and changed the Wi-Fi. She wrote back immediately saying to use school computers to stay in touch. After school, I went to the public library and used their Wi-Fi. I set up a new email account my parents didn't know about. Then I forwarded all my evidence there. Screenshots of the will, photos of the paternity test, the West Side brochure, everything. I felt like some kind of spy in my own life, hiding information and using secret accounts. But at least the proof was safe in multiple places now. That night, I stayed late at the library researching West Side Academy on their computers. I found forums where former students shared their stories. Kids talked about being woken up in the middle of the night by transport services. Strangers who showed up at their houses and physically removed them from their beds. They described West Side as basically a prison. No phone calls home, no visitors, staff who treated them like criminals. Parents paid thousands of dollars to make their difficult kids disappear. One girl wrote about being driven across state lines in the back of a van with no windows. Another described being restrained and medicated when she tried to resist. I read story after story until the library announced they were closing. My parents had been planning to have strangers drag me out of bed and take me away. The thought made me feel sick. I logged out of the computer and walked home in the dark. When I got there, I went straight to my room and wedged the doorstop back under my door. I wasn't sleeping without it anymore. The next morning, I grabbed a notebook from my backpack and started writing down everything. 8:47 a.m., parents' bedroom door locked. 8:52 a.m., whispering in hallway outside my room. 9:15 a.m., Mom watching me eat breakfast without saying anything. I wrote the date at the top of each page and kept the notebook in my backpack so they couldn't find it. Every time they did something weird, I pulled it out and added another line. It made me feel like I had some kind of control, like I was building a case instead of just waiting for them to ship me off. I documented when Dad checked my phone at dinner, when Mom asked if I'd talked to anyone at the school, when they both went silent the second I walked into a room. The notebook filled up fast. On Thursday night, I was doing homework when Mom knocked on my door. She came in without waiting for an answer and sat on the edge of my bed. She had this sad expression on her face that looked practiced. She started talking about how much they'd given up to keep our family together, how hard it had been staying married when they weren't happy. She said Westside was actually an amazing opportunity, a therapeutic program that would help me work through my feelings about the divorce. She kept using words like sadly and unfortunately and difficult decision. I sat there listening to her lie so smoothly and wanted to scream. She touched my hand and I pulled away. She left after 20 minutes of fake concern. An hour later, Dad showed up. He closed the door behind him and stood there for a minute before sitting in my desk chair. His voice came out quiet and broken when he finally spoke. He said he'd known since I was 3 that I wasn't his biological daughter, that grandfather's will had trapped him in this marriage, forced him to raise another man's child. He said he'd been angry at me for 11 years even though he knew it wasn't fair. That every time he looked at me, he saw his dead brother and the wife who'd betrayed him. He said he was sorry, but it didn't sound like he meant it. It sounded like he was just tired. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? He left and I wrote it all down in my notebook with shaking hands. Friday morning, Larson pulled me aside before first period. She said CPS had scheduled a home visit for Monday afternoon, and my parents had already been told. Her face was serious when she warned me they'd probably try to make everything look perfect, that they'd coach me on what to say. She told me I needed to be ready to speak up even if it felt uncomfortable, that this was my chance to tell someone official what was really happening. I nodded and felt sick to my stomach. All weekend, my parents went into overdrive. Saturday morning, Mom was scrubbing the kitchen counters at 7 a.m. Dad vacuumed the living room twice. They put fresh flowers on the dining table and baked chocolate chip cookies that filled the house with a fake homey smell. Sunday, they made me sit with them while they practiced their answers like we were rehearsing for a play. They told me to mention how much they loved me, how excited I was about the therapeutic boarding school opportunity, how our family was going through a rough patch, but we were working on it together. I sat there watching them plan their performance and felt like I was going crazy. Monday afternoon, a woman with a clipboard and kind eyes showed up at our door. Victoria Lewis from CPS. My parents transformed instantly into the perfect concerned family. Dad shook her hand firmly. Mom offered her coffee and cookies. They sat in the living room and answered her questions with practiced ease. Yes, they were going through marital difficulties, but they were committed to Lily's well-being. Yes, they'd looked into therapeutic programs because they wanted the best support for her during this transition. They were so smooth, so believable. I sat there feeling like I was watching strangers perform a show. Victoria asked questions and took notes. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. After 30 minutes, she said she'd like to speak with me alone. Mom hesitated, opening her mouth to object, but Dad put his hand on her arm and pulled her toward the kitchen. Finally, they were gone. Victoria turned to me and her voice got gentler. She asked how I was really doing. I pulled out my printed evidence from my backpack. The will, the paternity test, the Westside brochure with its fake marketing about therapeutic education. My hands shook, but I got through explaining everything. How they only stayed married for money. How they planned to send me away so they could date other people while keeping the inheritance. How Dad wasn't my father and they'd been lying about it my whole life. Victoria took notes and photos of the documents. When I finished, she explained that CPS couldn't actually prevent my parents from enrolling me in private programs. They had parental rights. But she could flag Westside as potentially unsafe and work with me on a safety plan if I felt threatened at home. It wasn't what I'd hoped for. I'd thought CPS could stop this. She gave me her card and said to call if anything changed. The next morning, I found Larson in her office before homeroom. I told her CPS couldn't stop my parents from sending me away, that I needed real legal help, not just reports and safety plans. She picked up her phone right there and made a call. She talked to someone for 5 minutes, then hung up and wrote down an address. She'd gotten me an appointment with a legal aid attorney for that afternoon. She said some situations needed more than school counseling and CPS reports, that I needed someone who could actually fight this in court. After school, I took the bus to a strip mall on the east side. Fiona Coleman's office was squeezed between a nail salon and a tax place. The waiting room had plastic chairs and outdated magazines. Fiona was younger than I expected, maybe 30, with tired eyes and messy dark hair pulled into a ponytail. Her desk was buried under case files and coffee cups. She listened to my whole story without interrupting. I showed her my evidence and she reviewed everything carefully. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and was quiet for a minute. Then she said we might be able to file an emergency motion to prevent residential placement, but I'd need more than documents. Judges don't like overriding parental decisions. She explained I needed witness statements from adults who could verify my parents' threats and my distress. Documentation of what Westside actually does versus what their marketing says. Evidence that this placement would harm me rather than help me. She gave me a week to gather everything. She warned me that family court moves slowly, that judges are reluctant to tell parents they can't send their kids to private programs, that even with good evidence this might not work. But it was the only real option I had. I left her office with a list of what I needed and a timeline that felt impossible. 1 week to build a case strong enough to convince a judge my parents were wrong. The next morning, I texted Ms. Larson asking if she could write down what she witnessed when I showed her the evidence. She responded in 5 minutes saying she'd have it ready by the end of the day. I called my friend's mom during lunch and explained I needed her to document the night I asked to hide my bag at her house. She said she remembered how scared I looked and would write everything down. That afternoon, I knocked on grandfather's door and asked if he'd write about the confrontation and what my parents admitted about the will. He hugged me and said he'd have it done by tomorrow. All 3 statements arrived in my email by Tuesday night. Mrs. Larson's was 3 pages describing my emotional state and the documents I'd shown her. My friend's mom wrote about how I'd asked to store my go bag and seemed terrified of going home. Grandfather's statement detailed the confrontation and how my parents admitted they only stayed married for the inheritance money. I forwarded everything to Fiona with shaking hands. Wednesday night, I was doing homework when Mom knocked on my door. She came in with Dad right behind her and said they were concerned about my internet usage. Dad held out his hand and told me to give him my laptop and phone. I handed them over without arguing because I'd already uploaded everything important to the cloud that morning. Dad took my laptop to his office and I heard him opening files and clicking around. He came back 20 minutes later with this look on his face. He demanded to know where I was hiding my files and what I'd done with all the documents. I just stared at him until he got so frustrated he left my room and slammed the door. Mom followed him out without saying anything. I heard them arguing in their bedroom about how I was always one step ahead. Thursday during study hall, I logged into Dad's email on the school computer. I found messages between him and someone named Jennifer talking about apartment hunting and furniture shopping. She wrote about how excited she was to finally start their life together once he was free. I felt sick reading it, but I kept scrolling. Then I found Mom's emails to someone named Arthur. They were planning trips and talking about moving in together after the divorce. Both of them were already building new lives while pretending to be my parents. I took screenshots of everything and saved them to my secret email account. Looking at those messages made me feel dirty, like I was reading someone's diary, but I needed the evidence. That afternoon, I got an email from my grandmother. The subject line said, "About Andrew." She wrote that she and grandfather wanted to meet with me to discuss the will and their son. She said they had no idea I existed as Andrew's daughter, and they were heartbroken they'd missed 14 years of knowing their granddaughter. Reading that in the school bathroom made me start crying. So hard I had to splash cold water on my face. A girl came in and asked if I was okay, but I couldn't even answer her. I just locked myself in a stall until the bell rang. When I got home, I told my parents that my grandparents wanted to meet with me. Dad immediately jumped in and suggested we all have dinner at our house this weekend. He used this fake, cheerful voice like we were planning a party. I said no. I told him I'd meet them at a coffee shop with Miss Larson present. The look on his face was like I'd slapped him. He started saying something about family privacy, but I walked away and went to my room. Mom followed me upstairs and tried to convince me to have the meeting at home, but I refused. She finally gave up and left. Saturday morning, I took the bus to Starbucks on Main Street. Miss Larson was already there, sitting 2 tables away with a book. My grandparents arrived 5 minutes later carrying a folder. Grandmother hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. Grandfather had tears in his eyes. We sat down and he pulled out a copy of the will with the divorce clause highlighted in yellow. He confirmed that the $2 million forfeiture was real. Grandmother said they were meeting with their lawyer next week to discuss modifying the terms. She said the will was clearly causing more harm than good, and they wanted to fix it. We talked for over an hour about Andrew and what he was like. They showed me photos on their phone of him when he was younger. Grandfather said I had Andrew's eyes and smile. When we left, Grandmother made me promise to call her anytime I needed anything. That night, my parents were waiting for me when I got home. Dad said I was grounded for going behind their backs. Mom took my house key off my keychain and put it in her pocket. They said I wasn't allowed to leave the house except for school, and they'd be driving me there and back themselves. Dad stood in my doorway and told me they'd be watching me closely from now on. After they left, I texted Ms. Larson that I felt trapped in my own house. She responded immediately telling me to call her if anything got worse. Monday morning, Fiona called me before school. She said she was filing an emergency motion with family court requesting a temporary order to prevent my parents from placing me in any residential facility without court approval. She warned me that my parents would probably be served with papers today. She told me to expect them to be really angry when they found out. I felt my stomach twist into knots. The whole day at the school, I kept checking my phone, waiting for something to happen. I was in math class when my parents got served, but I didn't know it until that night. I was lying on my bed doing homework when both of them stormed into my room. Dad was yelling about how I was destroying the family and costing them thousands in legal fees. Mom was screaming that I'd ruined everything and they never should have kept me. I'd hidden my phone under my pillow with the voice recorder running. I captured Dad calling me an ungrateful mistake. I got Mom saying I'd wrecked their lives and she wished I'd never been born. The recording was 7 minutes long by the time they finally left my room, still yelling at each other. The screaming got so loud that our neighbor called the police. 2 officers showed up asking if everyone was safe. I heard Mom open the front door and suddenly her voice was completely calm. She explained it was just a family disagreement about household rules. Dad came downstairs using his reasonable voice saying everything was fine and their daughter was going through a difficult phase. The officers asked to speak with me. I came down and they asked if I felt safe. I wanted to scream no, but with my parents standing right there, I just nodded. The officers left after 10 minutes, but one of them told my parents they were filing a report about the incident. After they drove away, Dad turned to me and said I'd just made everything so much worse. I went to my room and didn't come out until morning. The next day, Victoria Lewis called while I was getting ready for school. She said CPS was recommending I be placed with a safe family while the court stuff went forward. The home environment had become too bad for me to stay there. She'd already found a licensed foster family willing to take me on short notice. I had 24 hours to decide if I wanted to leave. My hands were shaking when I hung up. I packed my bags that night without telling my parents. Wednesday morning, Victoria picked me up with all my stuff while Mom and Dad were at work. I moved in with Sydney Brooks and her husband Ragnar that afternoon. Their house smelled like vanilla candles and had family photos covering every wall. They showed me to a small bedroom with a desk and bookshelf. Sydney said I could decorate however I wanted. That's when I realized I'd never had permission to make my own space before. My old room had always been exactly how Mom set it up when I was 5. At the school on Thursday, everyone seemed to know something happened, because I was suddenly living with a different family. The whispers followed me down the hallway between classes. I kept my head down and refused to explain anything to anyone except my closest friend. I hated how my private nightmare had become public gossip. Kids stared at me during lunch. Some girl I barely knew asked if my parents were in jail. I ignored her and ate my sandwich in the library instead. Miss Larson pulled me aside after third period and said she wanted to start meeting with me twice a week during study hall for informal counseling sessions. She taught me breathing exercises for when the panic got too bad. I told her I felt guilty for breaking up my family even though I knew they broke it themselves. She said feelings don't have to make sense to be real. That helped somehow. Friday afternoon, Mom texted me a long message about how she was sorry I felt hurt, and she hoped I could understand their side someday. Every word was carefully chosen to avoid admitting she did anything wrong. I showed it to Fiona, who said it was a classic non-apology designed to look good if the text ended up in court. She told me to save it but not respond. That weekend, Dad sent me a photo of Uncle Andrew from before I was born. He was standing next to Dad at some family cookout. Dad included a note explaining Andrew died in a car accident when I was 6 months old. He wrote that Andrew was his best friend, and losing him destroyed him. Then finding out about the paternity made the grief turn into something ugly. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd gotten from either parent. I stared at the photo for a long time. Andrew had my eyes and the same smile. Monday after school, Fiona met with me to prepare for the emergency hearing scheduled for next week. She explained exactly what the judge could and couldn't order. Judges usually give parents a lot of power unless there's clear proof of harm. Our goal was to prove the West Side placement was punishment rather than help. We needed to show I had real safety concerns at home. She made me practice answering questions the judge might ask. My grandparents called Tuesday night to say they met with their estate attorney. He confirmed they could change the will to remove the divorce penalty part. They were filing paperwork this week to modify the terms. My parents could divorce without losing the money. That removed their reason to stay married, but it didn't fix the 14 years of hate. Wednesday morning, Victoria Lewis called to warn me that my parents contacted a different program called Summit Ridge. They were trying to arrange enrollment before the court hearing. She was writing everything down to present to the judge as proof they were trying to get around the legal process. I felt sick knowing they were still trying to get rid of me. Thursday night, the neighbor who lives behind our old house messaged me through my friend. She said she had security camera footage of someone coming up to my former bedroom window at 2 a.m. last week. She sent me the video showing Dad testing the window lock. I forwarded it to Fiona immediately with shaking hands. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the video of Dad at my window. I kept replaying it in my head while I tried to do homework at Sydney's kitchen table. Around 9, I went to take a shower. But when I got in the bathroom, I couldn't breathe. My chest got really tight and I started gasping for air like someone was sitting on my lungs. I slid down the wall and sat on the floor with my knees pulled up. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't hold them still. Sydney must have heard me making weird noises because she knocked on the door asking if I was okay. I tried to say yes, but no words came out. She opened the door and found me on the floor hyperventilating. She sat down next to me and put her hand on my back, but I couldn't stop gasping. She pulled out her phone and called Miss Larson even though it was past 9 at night. Miss Larson answered on the second ring and Sydney explained what was happening. Then Sydney put the phone on speaker and set it on the floor between us. Miss Larson's voice came through calm and steady. She told me to look at 5 things I could see in the bathroom. I stared at the towel rack, the sink, the shower curtain, the toilet, the tile floor. Then she said name 4 things I could touch. I pressed my palms against the cold tile and felt Sydney's hand on my shoulder, and the fabric of my shirt and the wall behind me. 3 things I could hear. Sydney's breathing, my own gasping, water dripping from the shower. 2 things I could smell. Sydney's shampoo, soap. 1 thing I could taste. The metallic taste in my mouth from breathing so hard. Miss Larson kept walking me through the exercise over and over for what felt like forever. Slowly, my breathing started to even out. My chest stopped feeling so tight. After 30 minutes, I could finally breathe normally again. Miss Larson told me I'd already survived the hardest part by speaking up, and tomorrow was just the next step. She stayed on the phone until I felt steady enough to stand up. Sydney helped me to my room, and I got into bed still wearing my clothes. I didn't sleep much that night. Friday morning, Sydney drove me to the courthouse downtown. The building was old with marble floors and high ceilings that made every sound echo. We met Fiona in the hallway outside the courtroom. She was wearing a dark suit and carrying a leather folder with all my documents inside. Victoria Lewis showed up a few minutes later with Ms. Larson. We all went inside together and I sat in a wood chair behind a table next to Fiona. The judge sat at a big desk at the front of the room. My parents were on the other side with their lawyer. I didn't look at them. The judge was an older woman with gray hair and reading glasses. She spent a long time looking through papers while everyone sat there in silence. Then she asked Victoria to explain the CPS investigation. Victoria stood up and talked about the West Side Academy plan and the Summit Ridge enrollment attempt and the security footage of Dad at my window. She said my parents were actively trying to place me in residential facilities against my will while the legal process was happening. Then Miss Larson talked about my emotional state and the evidence I'd shown her. She explained the will situation and how my parents admitted they only stayed married for money. The judge listened without interrupting. When everyone finished talking, the judge looked at my parents and said she was ordering that they could not place me in any residential facility without court approval. She said my temporary placement with the Brooks family would continue for at least 8 weeks while the court reviewed everything. My parents' lawyer tried to argue, but the judge cut him off. The judge kept talking. She said any contact between me and my parents had to be supervised by a neutral third party. She strongly recommended family therapy to address what she called underlying issues. Mom started crying, but it looked fake, like she was performing for the judge. Dad just stared straight ahead with no expression on his face. He looked like he'd already checked out mentally and was just waiting for this to be over. The judge asked if I had any questions. I shook my head. She told me I could leave and that the court would schedule a follow-up hearing in 8 weeks. We all stood up when she left. Fiona walked me out while Victoria and Mrs. Larson stayed behind to get copies of the orders. In the hallway, Sydney was waiting with Ragnar. They both hugged me and said I did great. I didn't feel like I did anything great. I just sat there while adults talked about my life. That afternoon, my phone rang while I was lying on the bed in Sydney's guest room. It was my grandmother. She said the will amendment had been filed that morning and would be effective in 30 days. She explained this meant my parents could finally split up without losing the inheritance money. She wanted me to know that my inheritance from Andrew's portion would be held in trust for me until I turned 21, no matter what happened with my parents. She said they were setting it up so Mom and Dad couldn't touch it. I thanked her and hung up. Then I just stared at the ceiling for a while, thinking about how everything was changing because of money. Over the next week, my phone kept buzzing with messages from relatives I barely knew. Aunts and uncles and cousins I'd only seen at big holiday dinners started texting and calling. Some of them said they always knew something was wrong with my parents' marriage. Others said I must be exaggerating and families go through rough patches. A few asked really nosy questions about the paternity test. My parents stopped showing up to family gatherings. My grandmother told me they were avoiding everyone because they didn't want to answer questions. Their perfect family image was falling apart, and people were finally seeing what they'd been hiding for 14 years. Some relatives took my side right away. Others acted like I was causing drama. I stopped responding to most of the messages. Fiona called me on Wednesday to explain something about the paternity situation. She said because Dad wasn't my biological father and Andrew was dead, the paternity issue wouldn't affect custody decisions. Dad had been my legal parent for 14 years, so the court would treat him as my father regardless of DNA. She said bringing up the paternity test in court would just make things more complicated without helping my case. We needed to focus on the neglect and the residential placement threat instead. That was the stuff the judge could actually do something about. I told her I understood, even though part of me wanted everyone to know the truth about Andrew. 2 weeks after the court hearing, I had my first supervised visit with my parents. It happened at a neutral office with a social worker sitting in the corner taking notes. Mom and Dad sat on one side of a table and I sat on the other. They tried to make small talk about school and asked about the weather. Mom asked if I was eating well at Sydney's house. Dad asked if I needed anything. Nobody said sorry. Nobody talked about what actually happened. They just filled the air with empty words while carefully avoiding anything real. The social worker watched us the whole time. After an hour, she said the visit was over. I left feeling completely drained, but also kind of relieved that I'd held my ground. They didn't try to hug me or touch me, and I was glad. 2 weeks after that, we had our first family therapy session. The therapist's name was Cordelia May, and her office smelled like lavender. She had us all sit in a circle and started by setting ground rules. She said we had to communicate respectfully and take responsibility for our actions. No blaming or deflecting. Mom immediately started trying to explain why she felt trapped in the marriage. Cordelia stopped her and said we weren't here to justify past choices. We were here to address how to move forward. Dad tried to say the inheritance situation made everything complicated. Cordelia cut him off too and redirected to the actual issues. Every time my parents tried to make excuses, she shut it down. Mom kept shifting in her chair, looking uncomfortable. Dad crossed his arms and stared at the wall. I mostly stayed quiet and let Cordelia do her job. Back at the school, I started sitting at a different table during lunch, away from the groups that whispered about me. I brought my homework and ate while studying. It was easier than dealing with questions and stares. My grades actually started going up because I wasn't constantly anxious about what was happening at home. Math made sense again. I could focus on reading assignments. Mrs. Larson pulled me aside one day and said I seemed calmer even though my situation was still complicated. I told her it helped knowing where I stood. The uncertainty was hard, but at least I wasn't living in a house with people who hated me. 3 weeks after the emergency hearing, Fiona called to say the court scheduled a status hearing for 8 weeks out. That meant 2 more months before they'd review everything and decide next steps. 2 more months of not knowing where I'd live permanently. Sydney said learning to sit with that kind of uncertainty was a skill most adults never master. I was learning it at 14. Some days it felt impossible. Other days I managed to just focus on getting through school and therapy and supervised visits. I kept my documents in a folder in Sydney's guest room, just in case I needed them again. Just in case my parents tried something else. A week later, Victoria called and said it was time to get the rest of my stuff from the house. She picked me up on a Saturday morning and we drove to my old neighborhood in silence. Walking through the front door felt weird, like visiting a museum of my old life. My parents weren't home because Victoria scheduled it that way. I went straight to my room and started filling boxes with clothes and books and the random stuff you collect over 14 years. Victoria stood in the doorway watching to make sure everything stayed calm. I opened my desk drawer and found the Westside Academy brochure still sitting there with its fake smiling teenagers on the cover. I picked it up and tore it in half, then in half again, then kept ripping until it was just tiny pieces of glossy paper in my hands. Victoria didn't say anything, but I saw her nod slightly. We loaded 4 boxes into her car, and I took one last look at my bedroom before closing the door. Bringing everything to Sydney's house and unpacking it in the guest room felt like reclaiming parts of myself that my parents tried to throw away. The 4th therapy session happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Cordelia had us sit in our usual spots and started by asking Dad if he had anything he wanted to say. He stared at the floor for a long time before speaking. He said that every time he looked at me, he saw Andrew, and it reminded him of losing his brother. He admitted he'd been angry at me for existing when Andrew didn't, which made no sense, but that's what grief did to him. He said he directed all his pain at me instead of dealing with it properly. Hearing him finally say it out loud hurt, but also made me feel less crazy. Like all those years of feeling unwanted weren't just in my head. Cordelia asked how that made me feel, and I said it was validating. Dad didn't apologize exactly, but he stopped pretending I'd imagined everything. 2 sessions later, Mom finally spoke up. Cordelia asked her to explain why she stayed in the marriage, and Mom's whole body went tense. She said she was terrified of being alone and broke. She said the shame of her choices made her resent me for being the reason she felt stuck. She didn't say sorry, but she stopped acting like everything had been fine. She admitted the marriage was dead and had been for years. She said looking at me reminded her of every mistake she'd made. It was honest in a brutal way that felt like progress, even though it hurt to hear. My grandparents started inviting me to lunch every other Saturday at this diner near their house that served massive pancakes. They brought photo albums and showed me pictures of Andrew from before I was born. He looked so much like Dad, but younger and happier. They told me stories about him playing guitar and working on cars and making everyone laugh. They were careful not to trash my parents, but they made it clear I was wanted. They said Andrew would have loved being a father if he'd lived long enough to know about me. Having that connection to my biological father helped fill in gaps I didn't even know existed. They showed me his high school yearbook and his college acceptance letter, and I felt like I was meeting someone important who I'd never get to actually know. 6 weeks after the emergency hearing, Fiona called with an update. She said my parents officially canceled my enrollment at Westside and withdrew their application to Summit Ridge. The court order was working. She said their lawyer told them trying anything else would only hurt them in future custody stuff. I asked if they could still try to send me somewhere, and she said technically yes, but it would be really stupid. She sounded confident, which made me feel safer. I took all the birthday money I'd been keeping in my desk drawer and went to the bank with Sydney. We opened a savings account in my name, and I deposited $230. It felt like a tiny amount, but Sydney said starting somewhere was what mattered. She helped me create a budget on a spreadsheet and showed me how to track what I spent. She taught me about interest and emergency funds and saving for goals. My parents never bothered teaching me any of this stuff. We spent an afternoon researching high schools in the area, and I started thinking about extracurriculars I might want to try. Planning for the future in concrete ways made everything feel more real and less temporary. During my next check-in with Miss Larson, she asked me to describe what safety felt like now. I had to think about it for a minute. I told her I could sleep through the night without wedging my door shut. I told her safety felt like having adults who actually listened when I talked and took my concerns seriously. It felt like having a plan instead of just reacting to whatever my parents did next. She smiled and said that was real progress. 2 months after everything exploded, I was living with Sydney and Ragnar in their guest room that I decorated with posters and string lights. I saw my parents every other week for supervised visits that were awkward and surface level. I had lunch with my grandparents on Saturdays and heard more Andrew stories. I went to therapy to process all the stuff that happened. It wasn't some happy ending where everyone learned to love each other and everything got fixed, but it was stable and safe. I was building a life where I wasn't just trying to survive anymore. I was making actual plans for a future I wanted. My parents were moving forward with their divorce now that the will got amended. Our relationships would probably never be warm or close, but at least the lying was over and I knew exactly where I stood with them. And that wraps it up. I love when simple stories remind us how much we can still learn or improve. If this one sparked an idea, that's the goal. Subscribe so you'll be here when the next one drops.